Welcome to Cash Plays, and now your host, Bart Hanson.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another week of Cash Plays. I am Bart Hanson. Today's episode of conversation with AEJones. As always, you can send me an email at cashplays@pokerroad.com. Send me over a Skype at bart.hanson, and check out the Poker Road forums, pokerroad.com/forums, and there's a forum about Cash Plays. Just a couple of things before we go to break and before we get Aaron Jones, great, again, heads up and 6-max, no-limit player from Lego Poker here on the show. You know, there was a couple of episodes ago, maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago, when I talked about moving down and why someone should move down, or, you know, what you think about moving down. Now, when I did that episode, I actually really hadn't moved down. I've still been playing basically 10-20, no limit, and you know, mostly at the Commerce, and sometimes I'll play in private home games that are bigger, up to 25-50, and sometimes I've played 50-100. It's really interesting, though, because the last couple of months I have not really been happy with the way that I've played. I was a small loser, I think, in August, and a small winner in September, and even though the 10-20 game is great, the game is still really swingy, you know, and end up winning maybe $5,000 after putting in like 100 hours of work. And, you know, having days where I've been up 7,000, other days where I've lost 4,000. You know, I thought to myself, I really should kind of retool my game. And even though I'm properly rolled for the 10-20, I had a lot of things going on this month in October. I paid a guy for personal training. I'm in a kind of a intense physical training, you know, workout. That cost me a lot of money. I paid a guy for some personal coaching, some life coaching. That paid a lot of money, or that cost me a lot of money. I'm also getting paid, of course, for my FSN gig, which pays me a lot of money over the next 3 months. So I have really decided to play 5-10 for at least a few weeks, for at least 2, 3, maybe 4 weeks, just because not only I think it's kind of a, you know, retooling of my game, but a lot of people don't realize that, you know, poker, no matter, you know, I consider myself really, you know, it was funny when I was on Poker Road Radio and I called myself tilt-proof. No one's really tilt-proof, but I'm really emotionally strong, and I don't let the losses really, you know, affect me. But inherently, they're always going to affect you in some way. And what I realized was, and a lot of people, you know, if you guys have a parallel with what's going on in my life, you should really take a step back and think about it. When you have a lot of other things going on outside of poker, poker can really affect those other things in a bad way if you are either playing bad or on kind of the bad side of variance. It's been absolutely amazing just playing 5-10 for, you know, a week or two, how much my mind is totally at ease and how much more value I think I'm getting out of the services that I've paid for in my therapy and in my physical training. And I didn't want to have to worry about, you know, scheduling physical training, you know, at 11 a.m. and then playing 10-20, you know, at 3 a.m. and I'm stuck, you know, $7,000-8,000, and, you know, then I have to go home or I stay there and I can't concentrate on some of the things outside of poker. So the moral of the story is that if you have other projects going on outside of poker, even if you consider yourself a poker professional, I don't really think it's a bad idea to kind of either tone it down or step down so that poker doesn't affect some of these, you know, some of these other things outside of your life. And that's what I've kind of found in the last few weeks, and my mind is totally at ease. I wanted to get to something that I have not mentioned on the show, and that's the Red Pro strategy discussions over on pokerroad.com. And this is under Poker Discussion. It's another forum, you know, another thread or another portion of the forums and the sub-forums of the forums. And basically only professionals that Poker Road is tagged as Red Pros can post, and, you know, I can post, and people who are talent can post. And Phil Ivey has posted. Barry Greenstein posts this a lot. Justin Bonomo, Daniel Negreanu, Taylor Caby, Isaac Barron, looking at Jonathan Little, Death Donkey, Chris Fitch, just, tons and tons of big, important thinking players, Daniel Lahi, Jay Rosenkrantz, post over there. And it's not cluttered like some other types of forums with Flame. It's kind of a controlled forum, and I think the point of the forum is to allow pros to post things without the feeling that they're going to be attacked, which again has really happened on some of the major forums out there. So it's really something that I think you should check out, even if you haven't checked out the Cash Plays forum. And I wanted to get to a hand that Brian Devonshire posted. And this was a hand he posted a couple days ago, and I actually responded to it, and it was about him basically rivering an underfull on a paired board in a 5-10, $1,500 max buy-in game at the Bellagio. And the hand itself is basically straightforward. I think it's a pretty easy answer to what Brian was trying to ask. But what I added in, and if you get a chance to look, I added in some information about how this hand will change if you're deeper. And basically, I'll go through the hand really quick. And I don't have time to read all the history, but Brian opens with, let's see what the stacks are here. Effective stacks are 1150. He covers. He opens to 40 with pocket sevens on the button. Both the blinds call. The board comes out Queen 10-10 rainbow. The pot's $120. Check. He bets 100. One guy folds and one guy calls. Now again, some people have said, well, that's too much of a bet. That's not the point of this hand here. Let's just go through the hand relatively quickly. He bets with pocket sevens 100. One guy calls. Now the pot's 320. Turns a 9. Obviously, that's going to complete King Jack. A total Badoogie board. 4 of different suits. Check. Brian checks behind. I have no problem with that whatsoever. River now is a 7. Now Brian rivers under full. The villain bets 200. He has 800 left in his stack. Brian asked, he said, what should we do here? Now, when the guy bets 200 into 320 and you call the 200, the pot is now 720. So if you were to shove all in, the pot's about 1520, 800 to call. And I said in my response to this hand is the beauty of playing in a capped game with relatively short stacks is that you do not have to worry about raise folding on the river here. You don't have to worry about a big 3-bet back at you. And I think that this is a relatively standard shove here because at the 5-10 level, it's very rare anyone's going to fold the 10. No one's going to fold King Jack. Guys might even find some sort of reason to call you with some sort of random queen. But the point that I thought that was interesting with this hand, and again, this is what I posted in responses. If you're playing deeper and the variables change, let's say the game is 10-20, and let's multiply the stack sizes by 4 and the pot size by 2. And that's pretty standard. So instead of, Brian opening for 40, he opens for 80, and the pot size basically balloons to 2. So here on the river, instead of the villain betting 200 into 320, he's bet 400 into 640. So the villain's bet 400 to 640. So now the pot's 1,040. When Brian calls, the pot's 1,440. But instead of the guy having 800 left in his stack, he has $3,200 left in his stack. So now the question becomes, can you value raise small enough here to get called by worse, but fold to a 3-bet shove? And this is what I want all you guys to ask yourself. Because I think that you are losing value if you don't raise here. I would probably raise something like 800 to 1,000. 1,440 after I call. Let's say I make it 1,000 more. The pot's 2,440, 1,000 for this guy to call. When he calls, the pot's 3,440. Now he's got 2,200 left in the stack after the call or the raise. If he shoves now, the pot will be 5,640, 2,200 for me to call. And I think, and this is where it comes in, where you have to ask yourself what type of player you are. If you are not the type of player that can fold your sevens full to a 3-bet all-in shove on the river, getting about over 2.5 to 1, that you probably should not raise. I think you're losing value by not raising, but I've seen it time and time again, and it's really a spew. The guy raises, and now instead of realizing that your 7-7 can never be good in this spot, or your 7-7 is equivalent to really you're set. The guy can only really be pushing back with a hand that's better than yours or a complete airball bluff. There's no hand that he is going to push back for value with. Put yourself in that villain spot. You're never going to push back from up front with King Jack. If you play King Jack as a check call flop, made it on the turn, check, bet the river, and now you're raised 1,000 and you've got $3,200 left in your stack, you are never going to shove with King Jack because you can never get called by a hand that you beat. There's no value in being shoving back with King Jack. So 7-7 there really is the equivalent to, you could say one pair. You could even say ace-king. There's just, I don't really see a difference, and this is really where people get a little confused, and they don't realize that seven's full there with that given action is probably no different than ace-king. Because the guy either has a total bluff that ace-king beats, or he has you beat. But you look at that, and I think it's the Zebo theorem where no one can possibly fold a full house. You look, well, my hand strength is 7-7. I'm never going to fold, getting those types of odds. I'm never going to fold, getting 2.75 to 1 with an underfull. But again, with the given action, your underfull can never be good 1 out of 3.75 times. And again, I've played the live 10-20 game for over a year now. I haven't seen one player that's capable of making a 3-bet airball bluff in that spot, at least at the Commerce. Now, maybe it happens online. Again, I'm not necessarily well-versed in those games that if you've got some sort of crazy history with the guy and he thinks you're just bluff raising and he decides to bluff re-raise back. But my point is that there's just absolutely no way that someone's shoving back for value with less in that spot. So, kind of what Chris Vitch talked about when we had the limit hold'em discussion, Death Donkey, that at the lower levels, your bread and butter play is bet folding when he was talking about limit hold'em. In this case here, and in a lot of cases in no limit up to even, like I said, the 10-20 live level, your bread and butter for extracting value is bet folding as well. Raising for value and then realizing that there's no way that you can call a shove here, and this is a perfect example of that hand. So again, take a look over at the Red Pro strategy discussions. With that, we're going to take a little break, and we will be back with AEJones right here on Cash Plays.
Cash Plays.
Previously on Poker Road Radio.
By the way, last night I sent Oral my little Tommy Lasorda message to him. Right?
A little Tommy.
You can read that one out to him.
You too, bro. Remember, fuck him. You're Oral Hershiser.
Right.
And this is
That's right.
Well, this is internet radio. We can go there.
This is literally, you guys can't see the sense. It might be the most broken English.
Yeah,
but it's like old English.
Text. It's text. You're allowed to do that.
I was responding. I was responding to Earl's message.
Yeah, it's like
his name's not Earl.
It's
yeah,
like,
number one.
It's like, oh crap, you saw who I drew.
Don't miss a moment. Tune in to Poker Road Radio and get all the action from the tournament circuit. Cash Plays.
Welcome back, everybody, to Cash Plays. Today's guest, AEJones. Today's episode, a conversation with AEJones. Aaron Jones, I appreciate you coming on the show. What's going on today?
Nothing too exciting. Just enjoying the weather. Thanks for having me on, Bart.
All right, super. I like to start these types of interviews or conversations, as I like to call them, just with kind of a timeline, or if you could give us a timeline as to how you came up in poker, where you are now in terms of like what your most common game is now to play, and, when you started poker, and, tell us about that time in between to how you, built yourself as a high-stakes online player.
Sure. Gosh, I want to say I started maybe 3 or 4 years ago, as soon as I was able to, playing online. And, playing live games, as I have no idea, 5 or 6 years ago, I guess now, as soon as Chris Moneymaker was on TV, right? And so I don't know, you started playing the quarter, 50 cent, games with your friends, and then, online poker sounds like a great idea. I had a friend that, I met at one of my friend's house, playing live poker, and he had won like $11,000 online. And when I heard that, I mean, granted this was over the period of like a year and a half, but when I heard that, I thought that was the most fantastic thing ever. He had made all this money and we were so young. So I guess from as early as that, I had sort of an ambition to make money playing online. Went through, for the first year or so, went through the standard, or at least I find it somewhat blanket among a lot of high stakes players even. Went through the old, build up your roll to a few thousand, bust it all in one night. Win a few hundred there, win a few hundred there, borrow money from friends, and a lot of trial and error, because I think especially of how unprecedented just such a young crowd was getting so good at a certain game, and how unprecedented the poker boom was. Had a lot of struggles, grinded my way eventually through mid stakes, learned bankroll management. And just as recently as, say, all of 2008 probably, I've pretty much been playing 25-50 and higher, and only no limit hold'em at the moment. Although, because of a lot of advice from friends, starting to dabble within the PLO realm, but not really too interested in limit games yet.
Well, so you basically started out in about 2004. Is that about right, or maybe the end of 2003?
Sure, that sounds accurate, yeah.
Yeah. And obviously you must have noticed a huge difference when the online legislation came through, which was like in October of 2006.
Yeah. Yep.
Those 2 months. At that point, right before the legislation, what was your regular game that you were playing like during that time in late 2006?
It's really funny because at the time I was playing like, I guess 2-4-6 max on Party. And I was playing 2-4-6 max, 4-6 tables, and I had just started to get like, the 10K, 20K, 30K roll online, and I think I just got off of like a 20K month at 2-4, and I was very excited, and then bam, the legislation just kind of hit like a train, and I got, very nervous. A lot of my friends got nervous. I actually had a friend who was playing slightly higher stakes than me at the time, and I had a friend who literally stayed up for an entire week straight playing 3-6 and 5-10 heads up with literally like 10-minute naps every 2 hours. He was so nervous that online poker was just going to die forever. He grinded 5-10 and 3-6 and made like something ridiculous, like $70,000 in a week. So yeah, at the time I was really only playing like 2-4 mid stakes, maybe shots at 3-6, and I really thought it was over when it passed.
And so, was there a critical point, because I want to ask you about Lego Poker and how you got involved with that, but, I had Leatherass on the show a few months ago, and he talked about how he didn't realize that he really wasn't that good of a player until, all of a sudden he went from making 9 or 10, PTBBs per 100 down to like 2 or 3 once the legislation passed, and then he really worked on his game with his site. I mean, did you feel that there was some sort of critical point that took, your game to the next level, so that now you're playing, 10, 20, 25, 50, 50, 100?
Yeah, two things come to mind. The first thing that comes to mind is that I really think that that win rates are really just don't even exist. I really think win rates don't even exist. And so at the time, though, I did think win rates existed. So I was worried about my hourly. I was worried about all these different things. And I kind of, for a brief moment, lapsed in judgment and started to play tournaments, which was a mistake, but it taught me a lot of things about all forms of poker, I guess. And I guess now I'm at least an above average tournament player, I would like to think. But so I spent 4 or 6 months playing tournaments, and eventually went back to cash games. But the biggest thing that I'll say that kind of took me from pre-legislation to post, to post-legislation, is really been just learning heads up. I had a very stagnant, 3 or 4 month period at 6 max, and that was about a little over a year ago, about a year and a half ago. I had a really, really stagnant period at 6 max where I was trying new plays. I was putting money in too light, and it was just not the way to go. And after that period of time, I just decided to learn heads up, and I absolutely took off. The skills required in heads up are applicable absolutely everywhere, are applicable in all forms of no limit hold'em. To the degree in which they're applicable, I'm not going to say, because obviously a lot of the hand reading you get heads up is not the same as the hand reading you have in full ring, where people's ranges are a lot more narrow. But heads up is basically the fast track to learning how to play no limit hold'em as fast as possible, I guess. And so that's really what made me a high stakes player.
Now let's talk about some of the differences in heads up when you're looking at board texture between, say, heads up, 6 max, and full ring. It seems to me that sometimes when you're playing heads up, a really, really good board to continuation bet when you have air, really good board texture, your opponent obviously realizes that that's really good board texture and might call you down with a hand like as light as like king high or ace high or something like that. I was watching some of your videos and I thought it was pretty impressive that you seem to identify your opponent pretty quickly within a match as guys that you would try to bluff off of ace high and shut it down, not continuation and bet enough, and then just try to value bet the hell out of those types of guys. How do you approach a good player versus what you perceive as a fish when you tag them like right away and heads up?
Yeah, absolutely. 2 things come to mind. The first is that there's a lot of, and this is I think the most common spot when a board comes down extremely dry. Let's just say ace high dry. Anything is applicable. Ace 7-2 rainbow. There's a couple of different ones obviously, or say paired and dry. So like 2 queens and a 5. Boards like that, it is just very hard from a math point of view, and I'm obviously no math whiz. I'm the first to say that I'm a quote-unquote field player or whatever. But from a pure math point of view, it's very difficult for your hand or your opponent's hand to hit that board. And so as the pre-flop raiser, most people continuation bet very light, and it's often correct to continuation bet light. But because of that, your opponent, assuming that he's a competent player, will know that. And then you know that he knows that. And then he knows that you know that he knows that. And then I can go on forever with exactly that sentiment. And so it basically becomes, at certain levels, a coin flipping game in which you usually have to make notes on players. I have played pretty much anyone who will play me at 25, 50, or 51 heads up, and I have notes on certain players that XYZ player will check raise bluff really dry flops in an attempt to get me to fold my A or C bet. I also have notes on ABC player who will not check raise bluff those flops because they think that it's too obvious that they're check raise bluffing. And so basically it all becomes a coin flipping game in which you just have to sort of feel out tendencies and make reads and make little notes on players, whether it's from an observed hand or a hand you're playing yourself. And to address the second question that you had, I think that especially as you're playing a regular, this sort of goes along with the first point. It becomes increasingly difficult to bluff certain people. I mean, I guess for several years I had a certain image on the forum where almost every hand I was posting ended up being me doing something ridiculously spewy or out of control, bluff happy, or a hero call or something like that. And that wasn't by accident. I mean, I'm not trying to create a forum metagame, although a lot of people do that. More or less, what I'm trying to do there is, it's not interesting to make a really tight fold. I mean, it's not interesting. So if you're gonna, most hands you will post on a forum or talk about with your friends will be you putting too many chips in the pot in one way or another. And so because of that, I have this certain stigma or image, and a lot of the high stakes regulars do, especially if you are with a training site. You have some sort of an image where, for one reason or another, you bluff too much or, blah, blah, blah. And so you have to sort of play off of that. And so because of that, I just have to know who I can bluff and who I can't bluff.
Now, tell us a little bit about your training site, Lego Poker. I mean, people are pretty familiar with Card Runners and Deuces Cracked. How do you guys go about, what's your approach to doing training sites, and how do you kind of differ yourself from those guys?
Sure. I think that the first thing that comes to mind is that we are well, first of all, we have a very well respected group of pros, well known. My name is Greg, Sea Beast, Strati, Sauce, Apathy. I mean, guys that have had a lot of success specifically at heads up and 6 max no limit hold'em. And in fact, that is the thing that differentiates us, is that we are exclusively 6 max no limit hold'em for the time being, with the exception of the once a month or twice a month PLO video, because some of our pros do play PLO as well, with the exception of the random tournament video or the random PLO video, which are few and far between. We focus on shorthanded heads up and shorthanded and heads up, Nolan Hold'em. And, you can take a look on some of I know that there's probably some data mining sites, I guess, and, there's, 2 or 3 or 4 of our pros maybe have won over 1 million already this year, say just on full tilt. You can see results, and you can see that we pride ourselves on being a site where the pros are having results in 2008 and going into 2009. And just in general, I think everyone appreciates us for the concentration on Nolan Hold'em 6 Max, so that they don't have to go on a Tuesday and look at the video and find out that it's a 2040 limit video full ring or something like that.
Right. Now, you were talking. Listeners actually posted this up. I started a little thread over on the Poker Road forums about what they want me to ask you, and actually you mentioned it as well in one of your videos about heads-up displays, Hold'em Manager, and Poker Tracker 3. It's interesting because I've asked the same question to 2 or 3 different pros, and they've all kind of said, well, I think that people depend too much on their HUD, and it's really not that big of a deal. I remember you saying, though, in your training video that you were a little upset that you still had Poker Tracker 2 running, that it was clunky, and you found it surprising that there's a lot of good winning players out there that just don't have good setups, and you wonder how much better they would be if they did have good setups. What's your whole feeling about that?
I don't mean to beat a dead horse, I guess, but I obviously feel the same as the other people you've interviewed, in that I think that it is a crutch that will usually limit your development to some extent. But by the same token, it's pretty hard to deny the fact that is real information. That is raw data. I think that playing heads up, you will get very, very little use out of it, because, or at least against a really good player. Because you'll end up taking for granted frequencies, and you'll end up sort of misinterpreting the information. But I think that for 6 Max, it's pretty important, and I think that if you train yourself to use the information, it's very important. For instance, if I really went through there and meticulously went through a guy's stats and tried to find his leaks or whatever, tried to find that he continuation bet too much on this type of board, which I'm sure everyone has some sort of leak like that. It's amazing what you can do in Hold'em Manager, which I have now. I actually just recently got Hold'em Manager. It's amazing some of the stuff you can look at. But honestly, I'm not going to lie, I've been a little too lazy to do it. I think that for some people who maybe don't consider themselves to have the experience or the reads, this is a great way to give yourself an advantage over your opponents, to go in there and kind of see for yourself what you're doing too much of, what your opponent's doing too much of, compare frequencies and things like that. Things that say, I would just say, quote unquote, I'm going by feel or by instinct or something like that.
It's interesting too. You said that you had kind of a stagnant period of time in your 6 Max game where you moved over to heads up. And we've been talking a little bit about this recently on Cash Plays. Was that a specific time, or were there other times in your career where you thought that you were just not playing well enough, where you really needed to retool your game, whether it was through some sort of coaching or moving down? And is that basically something that everybody goes through in terms of maybe a prolonged downswing, maybe a little bit of running bad, but also playing bad? And how did you cope with that?
Yeah, I think that the first thing to note, and I know that a lot of times I end up repeating a lot of things that a lot of great players will probably say, but it's very important to note, if you are running bad, you are probably playing bad and don't realize it, just because of the way the human mind is conditioned, as far as just not being able to tell that you are calling down too light or calling down too tight. That's another thing that can obviously happen, is just folding too much on the river because you're seeing skeletons in the closet, because of something that happened in the past. 2 weeks ago, you 3-bet the flop with a flush draw, and the guy snapped you with a set, and now today you are hesitant to 3-bet the flop with a flush draw. Even though you're doing fine against his range, you see one result, and that result kind of hinders you from making the correct poker decision. And I think that is what's really interesting about being a poker player, is that everything is extremely inexact. And so as a result, you can make a certain play against a range that is correct in the long run, but turns out to be wrong on certain occasions, and it makes it very, very difficult to play poker very well. And in fact, I think that the sort of mentality of poker in that regard is what's really interesting and what distinguishes people from having success at small stakes to high stakes and the whole spectrum in between. And just to quickly touch on the last thing that you said, I would say that learning a different game or taking a break are really good ways to deal with downswings, and going over sessions in Hold'em Manager or whatever type of software you use, and talking about hand histories with friends, constantly badgering people who you know are better than you with hand histories, and making them even make a small comment on it that can really change your entire perspective on poker.
I want to get into a couple of, or more than a couple, specific spots that I've seen in your videos, and let's talk a little bit about no limit theory. Obviously, it's going to apply to 6 max and heads up, or just general no limit, theory across the board. The interesting thing, Aaron, is that I play, like, my main game is playing 10-20 live, 10-20 no limit live at Commerce, where the game plays loose passive. It's a live game. And even at that level, the players aren't good enough players to know that most of the time their hand isn't good against my range. They just don't understand poker well enough. Now, it's interesting because that's one extreme, and now you look at even like 3-6 no limit or 5-10 no limit. Another extreme is when players just won't release top pair best kicker, or they won't release an overpair 100 big blinds deep. So my question to you is just general concept of how you're playing draws out of position at 100 big blinds deep, or in a loose passive live game, no matter how deep you are, if a guy's never going to fold. Does that make like hands like suited connectors from up front, of less value? How do you play draws from out of position? And I know that the answer is going to depend, but have you taken a different approach now that people are less likely to fold?
Yeah, again, it depends a little bit on what game you're in, obviously, as you said, but I think that as a general rule of thumb, if you have no showdown value, you almost always need to be playing your draws fast. And the sort of obvious, I guess, reason for that, perhaps not too obvious to some, is that when your draw misses and you get checked down to the river, or the turn goes check or whatever. Let's just say you check call the flop, and your draw misses and goes check on the turn, check, and on the river you lead or something like that. The most obvious thing is that when draws miss, you will get called down light. And so if you check call with 6 high, whether it's a straight draw or a flush draw, if you check call with 6 high, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. You're going to be in a lot of trouble on playing on later streets is basically the idea behind it. Now, as stacks get deeper, things change. Now, draws with showdown value are very, very different. And the reason I say this is because a lot of people misplay draws with showdown value. Now, if you have a pair and a flush draw or an ace-high flush draw on a board where there are possible straight and flush draws, so say ace-jack on 8-5-3 with 2 diamonds, you have ace-jack of diamonds, or you have 9-8 of diamonds on 8-5-3 with 2 diamonds, either way you have an extremely strong hand, obviously. Now, the case can be made that if your overcards will get bluffed, like let's say you're playing heads up, if your overcards are going to get bluffed, a case can be made for check calling because you have showdown value and a lot of his range that will bet flop and turn will be behind your range as a pure bluff, and because he might bluff an overcard that you might hit, or he might bluff when you hit your flush or whatever. However, most of the time you're going to want to check raise or play it fast in some way out of position, whether it's bet 3-bet or check raise. And the reason behind that is that when you have a draw with showdown equity, you are extremely, 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 extremely excited to get it on the flop to be against dominated draws. And the idea behind this is that you're either going to get it in, say, against an overpair where, I don't know the numbers, but I'm sure that with 8-9 of diamonds on 8-5-3 with 2 diamonds, I'm sure you're like 60-40 against pocket jacks. I'm sure that you're a favorite, maybe like 55 to 45. And so the bottom line is you obviously don't mind getting it in there, or you'll get it in as, say, a slight dog against a set. Well, not a super slight dog, but again, it's probably like 60-40 this time with you having the 40%. Or you're going to get it in against 7-6 off, and on 8-5-9, on 8-5-3, if the other guy gets it in with some kind of a shitty straight draw like 6-7 off, you're going to have an extremely high amount of equity there. And so getting it in versus worse flush draws, you can get it in versus the 6-4 of diamonds. If you have ace-jack of diamonds and you get it in versus king-queen of diamonds, you're at a very advantageous position. And so it becomes increasingly important to play draws fast in order to get your hand in on the flop versus worse draws. Obviously, things like that go out the window and everything changes when you get 300 big blinds deep. But I guess I'm speaking in generalities when you're like, say, 100 or 150 big blinds deep.
So I'm a little bit confused. Are you saying then that with draws with showdown value, people misplay them because they try to play them sometimes too fast when there isn't all that much fold equity, versus like a hand where if you have a draw that could crush another draw, if you play that fast, you might get the other draw to sometimes dump the hand, like a 7-6 off where they'd continue bluffing later on that example?
No, I gave a lot of I guess I gave a lot of information very fast. Basically, it is this, or this is to sum things up. If you have a draw with no showdown value out of position, you have pretty much no choice but to turn into a bluff and play extremely fast. By taking the lead and betting, or by check raising or whatever. Now, if you have a draw that has showdown value and can dominate other draws, then you do have two options. Frankly, you can't play a hand like that wrong. If you're playing someone who's extremely aggressive and you think they're going to fire multiple barrels, but they won't pay off light if you check raise, a lot of these things are very flow dependent. I mean, if I've never check raised in a match, but I'm constantly getting barreled on, then I can't imagine that I'm going to turn my pair plus flush draw into a check raise if he's just going to fold a high amount of time. I'd rather just let him barrel me off of it because I have a hand that can improve, might be the best right now, and is just extremely strong in general. So I do have an option of playing it slow. However, the pros to playing it fast are that if the player that you're playing against will get it in with worse flush draws, then it would be better to play it fast. And again, it's opponent dependent in that regard, in which case you're going to want to check raise or bet 3-bet or do whatever you can to get it in. You really can't play a big draw wrong. You really, I mean, unless you make some sort of an extreme equity mistake where you check raise and get a 3-bet and decide to do something weird like flat out of position when your draw is going to be difficult to plan later streets, that could be a mistake. But basically, you can't play a pair plus a flush draw wrong. It just is very opponent dependent.
Moving on to another topic, I saw that in your videos, and again, we'll touch on this because I want to touch on a couple specific questions I had. I saw that you were flatting a lot with, let's talk about blind versus blind play in 6-max. Ace rag, maybe offsuit in the big blind, small blind opens. You were flatting a lot there because you said that obviously the hand was too strong to fold, but I believe you said that if you're just going to flat and you're just going to miss, it's not always correct, that you got to choose right boards to make bluff raises at. And just talk about in general, like hands in the big blind versus blind that they're strong enough to flat, but you need, what type of boards you're looking at to bluff raise. Like if you call with, like a king 9 or an ace 5. You also said too that you're criticized a little bit, or some people have criticized you because you tend say that should be 3-betting with like king jack and king 10, where you say that sometimes you're flatting. So can you comment on those situations?
I guess the theory behind the blind versus blind battle and calling in position in the big blind, I'm going to play a huge range to a small blind open in the big blind because the value of position is extremely important and can really never be understated, or can really never be overstated. Excuse me. And so I guess my thought process there is just that I want to play a pot in position, and if I have a hand that is speculative like 9-6 suited, that's fine. If I have a hand like Ace-5 that has showdown value, that's even better, high five. Or, if I have a hand like King-9, that's fine too. And my reasons are, for say the 6-9 suited, deceptiveness and I'm going to have to bluff raise a little bit more with 6-9 suited because I don't have showdown value. Whereas King-9 and Ace-5 dominate some of their opening range in the small blind. He's definitely going to open with 5-4 suited, 6-5 suited, King-5 suited, hands like that. Probably a couple of smaller aces. And even if I am dominated by him having a bigger ace, I'm probably going to be able to lose less, again, because I have position. And basically, it's too much to really go into, except for give a few little generalities. But you're going to have a lot of advantageous post-flop positions with at least even marginal strong hands, getting 2-1 immediate if someone raises to 3x, blind versus blind, and you have any sort of read of them at all. If you have no read, but maybe you hear they're a strong player or something, you could fold, I guess. But bottom line is you're almost always going to be in good shape playing a pot in position. That's how simple that is. Now, flatting with face card hands out of the blind is a fairly simple concept, but is widely written about and criticized, and really, even among high stakes players, there's a ton of dissent. Which I think a lot of people say that No Limit Hold'em is obviously getting, say, closer to being solved, maybe, or something like that, where they think that frequencies are getting closer to perfect, and there's tons of information out there for people. And so it's really interesting that even among guys who are making 7 figures a year playing No Limit Hold'em, they disagree about things like flatting face card hands out of the blinds. I think that's really interesting. But the thought process behind it is pretty simple. If I flat queen jack off in the big blind, I believe that I will dominate a fair amount of queens and jacks when I believe I will dominate a fair amount of queens and jacks when we go to a flop. And in which case, we're always going to be going to a flop if I'm flatting closing the action. Obviously, it's opponent dependent, but anytime a guy is raising Jack 8 or Queen 9 suited, obviously I'm dominating a fair amount of his opening range from late position, and he should be opening light because it's good to open light in No Limit Hold'em, especially shorthanded. Now, going into the second part of the discussion, why don't you 3-bet? Well, it's not necessarily that 3-betting is a mistake, but I believe flatting to be better because I'm dominating hands that he's opening with, whereas if I 3-bet, he'll fold most, if not all, of those hands that I dominate, and he'll 4-bet me sometimes, in which case I'm sad because I don't get to see a flop, and he will call with hands that dominate me. So he'll call with Ace-Queen, and he'll call with King-Queen, and he'll call with Ace-King, obviously, or he'll put or whatever. Or Ace-King doesn't dominate Queen-Jack, but Ace-King or Ace-Queen, Ace-Jack, King-Queen, King-Jack, etc. I mean, those would be 4 hands that dominate me, that are always calling, never folding, and if we make a pair, 100 big blinds is going to go in instantly. And so that's the thought process behind that.
Let me ask you a question to follow up, though. How are you comfortable, though, playing that hand out of position and extracting maximum value when you hit top pair? Let's say you've got King 10 and the board comes out King high. Can you extract like a stack from a guy with a weaker king in that spot? Now, King 10 might be kind of a drastic example, but how about Queen Jack on a Queen high board or Queen Jack on a Jack high board?
It's extremely, extremely difficult to get into generalities. But a few things that I can say are that it's obviously cliche, is that it's very opponent dependent. But I think that more importantly than that, against some guys, it's just good to lead 3 streets and get called down by second pair because there was a flush draw on the flop and it missed by the river. Against some guys, it's good to check raise because they'll always put you on a draw and they'll get it in light. Against some guys, it's good to check call and let them barrel off. Some guys, it's good to check call 1 and even check fold the turn if an overcard comes. Some guys, it's good to check call 2 because they won't bluff the river. And a lot of guys, it's good to check call all 3 with top pair there. because you'll get multi-barreled.
Right. I guess my point is that it's just like what you were saying is that your tendency, or someone who has a tendency to flat there instead of 3-betting with 2 face cards. The reasoning behind it, I'm drawing from what you're saying is because you dominate a lot of the guy's opening range. And I guess again, the thing that I'm hazy about is that when you do dominate the guy's range where the hand is weak as queen jack, when you're flopping top pair, isn't he almost like put into some sort of defensive mode if you ever put heat? If he's opened with like queen 9 suited and the board comes out like queen deuce 3. Now, obviously, I don't play at the level online, but I mean, aren't people kind of putting the brakes on? I mean, wouldn't it be a little bit strange to see a guy stack a guy with queen jack?
Well, I'm not.
If he has queen jack versus queen 9 there.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily looking to instantly. I'm not going to instantly look to get 100 big blinds in on the flop. I just think that somehow 2 bets will almost always go in if we flop top pair over top pair. Whether it is he c-bets the flop and I call, and then he continues on the turn and I call again and he checks the river, or whether it's he c-bets the flop, the turn goes check check, and I value bet the river, in which case no one has ever folded top pair, especially not against me. Or alternatively, he could check back the flop, and I could just bet turn and river. In which case, once he checks back top pair and turns his hand into a bluff catcher, he can't ever fold turn and river there. And so, there's just a ton of little places, and it's just something I feel like I can't really describe on the air. It just would be impossible. There's just a ton of places where I think I'm going to play better post flop, even out of position, than my opponents, and I think that quite a bit of that is say an arrogance or a cockiness, and I'm fine with that because I don't think I ever have played in a 6-max game where I can't call with those hands out of the blinds, and I doubt that I ever will. I mean, I don't know that I'll ever want to play against a lineup where it's 2 or 3 guys. It's say an Ansky and a Raptor and someone else who's very Ike, or somebody who's very aggressive and is going to put a lot of pressure on me in position. Against those guys, I'm more apt to just fold, but pretty much never to 3-bet. Again, I'm just more likely to just go ahead and say, okay, I'll lay it down and play super tight out of position. Go ahead.
So a little more on this discussion, Aaron, about like say 2 face cards. Let's say that you're in late position and a guy, say maybe under the gun or under the gun +1 opens. Are you apt to call with like a queen jack, queen 10 in late position there? And can you also address maybe a late position in an opener like hijack or cutoff, and you've got queen jack, queen 10 on the button? Now you're liable to call there.
A few different things. In the first situation, it's very unlikely that I'm going to put any money in the pot when an early position raiser opens. And my reasoning for that is that I'm now all of a sudden doing the opposite of what I want to be doing, which is I'm dominated by more of his opening range than I am not. Because a lot of guys aren't opening, obviously, say, Jack 9, Jack 10 from under the gun, whereas they might be from the cutoff. Now, cutoff and hijack is extreme, and in those cases, I'll almost always fold. But in cutoff and hijack, it's a very different situation. Depending on if you're playing full ring or 6-max. In 6-max, hijack ends up also being under the gun +1. And I think there's kind of a line, say, between hijack and cutoff, in which case hijack plays a lot more like under the gun and cutoff plays a lot more like on the button. It's just sort of a random distinction that I make. I'm not really sure. I don't know if it's like a mental thing, too, if players tend to open, say, the difference between their cutoff opening range and their button range is obviously much less than the difference between, say, their hijack opening range, which is also under the gun +1, and their cutoff opening range. And so, because of that, you can treat cutoff like he's opening extremely wide, and so you can be more likely to flat hands like queen jack. Now, there's a few different stipulations I need to make. The first is that if either of the blinds is extremely squeeze happy, this is just not going to be fun to do. The reason is because if they're squeeze happy, you'll obviously very often have to fold your hand, or you'll have to call and play a very high variance flop where you're calling and shoving a lot of flops, or calling and calling down when you make a pair, or 4-betting light, or a lot of extremely exciting things that are not really good poker plays. And so my thought process there is that I'm usually not going to want to call if they open in, say, the cutoff and you're in position on the button with a queen-jack type hand and the blinds are squeezy. Now, what can I do? I can do one of two things. I can obviously fold, which I'm fine with. I can 3-bet here, and a 3-bet becomes much, much better here because it shows a better immediate profit and you get flatted by less hands when they're out of position. So 3-betting in the blinds with queen-jack is totally different than 3-betting on the button with queen-jack. And so because of that, I mind 3-betting less. I usually still don't do it, but I mind 3-betting less. Now, if you do not have a squeezy player in the blinds, and particularly if the cutoff opener is not that great of a player, whether he's too tight post-flop, too aggressive post-flop, maybe just a huge loose passive fish, and you want to play any 2 cards on the button against him, in this case, you can call and expect to see a lot of flops. Try to make pairs. Sounds kind of simple, but let's be honest. You want to make pairs. I mean, that's the reason for playing a face card type hand. You'd like to make pairs, obviously, 3 of a kind, 2 pair, etc. Maybe even a straight. And so you're going to be able to play those pairs well in position, and you should be able to effectively against his range. Alternatively, you have the added EV of the button, which is extremely high. I mean, even the worst players in the history of the world might be winning players from the button, and that's just a simple fact that the button is extremely advantageous in all forms of poker, specifically, though, obviously, in no-limit and pot-limit games. And so because of that, you're going to be able to bluff raise flops, float flops, etc., and all of them add to the EV of flatting with a hand in position.
There was another concept that's kind of similar to this, 3-betting with like 2 face cards thing on the button that you talked about in your videos, and that was the fact that you were more likely to raise limpers when you've got aggressive players behind you and in the blinds, whereas you're more likely to just kind of over limp if you've got tight, straightforward players like to the left of you in the blinds. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, like you said, the concepts are similar in that it's basically right of first initiative. Who gets to be aggressive, I guess. As soon as somebody limps, they're seen as maybe the spot at the table or, the loose passive fish. And so because of that, the aggressive players are extremely likely to attack them and just try to gain that AV by raising their limp and continuation betting a lot of flops. And so they might raise it wider, etc. Now, what does that mean? If I have an aggressive player behind me, he doesn't care if I limp behind. I mean, he knows that I'm never going to limp behind or extremely rarely limp behind with a very big hand like 2 kings or 2 aces. And so because of that, he's going to ISO me very wide just like he would the limper, and he'll pretty much never get a limp re-raise or anything random out of me. And so because of that, if I have aggressive players behind me, I would rather go ahead and just isolate a fish or isolate a loose player as fast as I can, in which case I sort of gain the right to first initiative, and the aggressive player doesn't get to isolate both of us. And so I guess in that vein, in that sort of thought process, there are some spots when I would still limp behind if I had a hand that played really well multi-way, something like small suited connectors which made straights and flushes, or a small pair which I'm just trying to see a flop with, and it can play a big pot because it can play a limp pot where you have a very large pot to stack ratio effective, whereas Queen Jack doesn't want to play a large pot. They don't want to play a pot. They don't want to play a large pot in a limped pot because you're going to have reverse implied odds, and you're not going to want to put, say, 200 big blinds in with Queen Jack if you flop a Jack on Jack 8-5 in a limped pot, because the pot to stack ratio is extremely deep, and you're going to be more trying to bluff catch and control the size of the pot. Whereas if you flop a set of 5s in that spot, you can play for infinite stacks because a set is always the pure nuts. So I guess in that spot, it's just I'm more so distinguishing between hands that are good to play multi-way and hands that are not good to play multi-way. And obviously the other factor is that if players are tight and straightforward behind me, I can, I'm okay to get away with limping, and they're not going to mess with my limp as much as aggressive players will.
A couple more questions here, and again, I appreciate you taking the time. I want to address specifically ace rag suited. Calling raises out of position with ace rag suited in the blinds, and maybe possibly I saw you over limp a couple, or you called raises in position with ace rag suited. On ace high boards, like there was a hand on the video where the board came out ace 9 queen rainbow, where you had called a raise from a guy and you were in position and the guy fired once. The turn brought a backdoor club draw. It was the 6 of clubs. The guy fired again, and then the river was an offsuit 10, so we were looking at ace 9 queen 6 10, and then he fired 3 times and you folded ace 4. Sometimes even in my own game I get a little lost in the sense of, if you're going to call the flop, now he fires the turn, and now now you call the turn. When do you release the river, or when do you sometimes release the turn? When you've hit an ace, when you're there with ace rack suited, then obviously it's more difficult out of position.
Yeah, in that particular spot, a few things come to mind. The first is that obviously my hand range on the flop is my hand is strong on the flop. I have top pair, and it's extremely basic thinking, but it's really all I need to be thinking about. He'll c-bet the flop a lot, and I have top pair, so it's an easy call. On the turn, I would, sometimes against some guys, not, I guess fold it, but still I would almost always call the turn. And the reason for that is because there are some second pair hands I can have, whether it's a 9 or a queen or some kind of a random straight draw. And so when the 6 of clubs turns, he might bet that with pure air, trying to get me to fold one of those second best hands. Or alternatively, since a club draw turn and a straight draw turned, 7-8 was pure air and is extremely likely to bet the flop. And a club draw was also pure air and just a backdoor club draw, and so it's also very likely to bet the flop. And since those hands increase their equity, they're very likely to double barrel the turn. Now, when the river comes down to 10, it's actually more likely to help my hand than anything else. It's pretty unlikely that I can have anything other than some sort of pair, whether it's a king-queen type hand or more than likely ace-x of some sort, whether it's ace-10, ace-jack, some smaller ace like I had, ace-4, ace-6, ace-7, any of those aces. And I just don't think, based on my reputation, based on what my opponent will perceive of me, that I will get triple barreled on an ace-high board very often at all. Do I call there with some frequency? Of course I do. I will base it on the timing of my opponent and his general state of mind, depending on if he's playing other tables and maybe he recently got stacked and therefore is more likely to bluff, or I will depend it on the fact that I've been folding in those situations and I think his 3-barrel percentage is very high, and so sometimes I'll call down there. But as a general rule of thumb, I would think that just looking at the hand in a vacuum, it's probably a fold.
Now, what do you think about guys, and again, I don't mean to grossly overgeneralize, but what about a guy that says, I have trouble playing ace rag suited out of position. I don't want to call a raise, say from the first, I don't want to call in the big blind an under the gun raise or a hijack raise with something like ace 8 suited. Are you losing too much value there by not calling in the big blind? And at what point are you losing too much value? Let's say when the cutoff opens or the big blind opens. I'm assuming there's some point where that hand is too good to fold, even when you're out of position, right?
Sure. You may or may not be losing value. What I always tell my students and I guess anybody who asks me in general, it's probably less of a mistake, relatively speaking, to play tight out of position or to fold out of position. So even if you lose a few dollars in equity by folding ace-8 suited to a cutoff open or a middle position open or whatever, it's extremely likely that you would be losing more money by calling and playing the hand poorly out of position. Now, I tend to think of myself as a special case, along with maybe another half dozen no limit hold'em players in the world. I have no idea. I'm sure some are better than others at playing out of position, in that I'm cocky enough to always be okay with calling there or want to call there and just don't like folding. And so because of that, I'm pretty much never going to fold ace-8 suited to a single open. I'll just play it post-flop and gamble it up a little bit, I guess. I mean, maybe the call is neutral EV. So if someone told you that the call was neutral EV and you were going to take the high variance road, some people would reject it and I might accept it. I'm not really sure. Again, I have very inexact numbers and inexact thoughts for what my lifetime is of calling out of the big blind with ace-x suited. But as a part of a balancing scheme with other hands that I call out of positions, small pockets and face card type hands, as a part of that type of scheme, I'm very happy with calling ace-x suited out of position there. And so because of that, I can't, I guess it's kind of do as I say and not as I do. I believe that's the correct statement, or at least pretty close to it, in that I don't, if my students say, well, I'm uncomfortable doing that, I always get screwed when I do that. Hey, maybe your sample size is small, or maybe you really struggle playing pots out of position, in which case folding will probably be a smaller mistake than calling and playing very clunky post-flop out of position.
Now, again, let's say that a guy does call with a hand like, ace-8 of clubs out of position to, an early to mid-position raiser, and, the board comes out, and he's heads up, and the board comes out ace-9 deuce. It just seems to me like, are you almost always forced to play that hand as a check call? It seems to me from the last couple of years of the games, and even in aggressive live games, if you lead out on the flop when you flop top pair, you're so likely to get bluffed raised that you put yourself in a spot that you absolutely hate, unless your intention is to get bluffed raised. But I don't know, if you want to play 150 big blind pot with, ace-8 on an ace-9 deuce flop, an ace-9 deuce flop. So are you almost forced to almost check call every single street?
Well, there's two basic thoughts. The first is that if you do decide to lead, you better have a plan. You better go in there with either multiple barrels for value, or I plan on getting floated when I bet the flop, and so I'm going to check call the turn, or I plan on getting bluff raised when I bet the flop, and so I'm going to bet call it. And if you do not have a plan, you probably made a pretty big mistake. And my other thought is that the reason that check call is usually best on that board is that if you check raise, it'll be difficult for him to proceed with worse unless you have a read that he specifically likes to float you when you check raise that flop, or if you check raise bluff that flop a lot. And the reason that check call becomes good is because people still in today's games continuation bet too much. And if they're continuation betting too much, especially on an ace-high board, then check call seems like a pretty obvious plus EV play.
All right, Aaron, I'm going to ask you one last question. This is an interesting hand that came up on one of your videos. I'm not sure if it was in one of your 5, 10, 6 tabling videos or if it was from an earlier video. But the villain that you said that you were playing again, you said he was a clown face. So obviously he didn't really have a lot of respect for his game. That was a nice choice of words, by the way.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
And you opened on the button with ace-deuce of clubs, and the guy called in the big blind, and I think your effective stacks were over 100 big blinds deep, or it might have been, well, it was at least 50 big blinds deep, but it wasn't really relevant to what happened in the hand. And the board came out queen 5 jack with 2 diamonds. He checked, you made a continuation bet, the guy called. The turn was a 6 of clubs, it went check, check. The river was a deuce, which gave you ace deuce, gave you bottom pair with an ace kicker. He bet, and you said that this is almost like a snap call, a very standard call. And you said that you expect that this guy has got to draw more often than not, and he did. He had 9-7. Now, my question is, remember, the board was queen 5 jack 6 deuce. The reason why you were able to really make that call so quickly, or to think that you're good so quickly, is because this particular villain's range is so polarized, because he's not really capable of making like thin value bets with like middle pair. I think you even said in the video that he might not even bet like a weak type of top pair. So it's almost, his hand almost has to exclusively be like a monster or a bluffed draw.
Yes, exactly. It's basically that if I called him a clown face, he likely did something to earn it. He probably played a hand in some way which was, in my opinion, substandard, I guess. In other words, he probably played some ridiculously awful hand, and so I definitely had a read on him that he was not that good. Now, exactly what you said is true, and I talk about this a lot in my memoir series. I actually have like a coaching program that I've been doing that I call my Memoirs of AEJones, and so basically his range on that river for value betting is extremely, extremely, extremely narrow. Now, let's just say that he gets to the river with his entire subset of hands that he check calls the flop with and the turn goes check, check with. If we make that subset something like any queen, any jack, any straight draw, and any flush draw, let's just assume he'll check call the flop with that range of hands. There is some percentage of the time he's going to check call with bottom pair also. Some percentage of the time he'll check call with a very strong hand like top 2 or bottom set. And some percentage of the time he'll check call with something random like an overpair. But let's just assume that his standard range is a pair of jacks, a pair of queens, a flush draw, or a straight draw. Now, by the time the river comes down, and it's really completely irrelevant that it pairs my 2, because there's really no hand between ace high and a pair of 2s that I expect him to have, except maybe on some occasion ace 10 or probably not ace 9, but maybe ace 10. So I guess it improves my hand, by 1% or something like that. Now, if he check calls with the range that we've established he check calls with, and the turn goes check, check, by the river, let's analyze what range he bets. No one really bets a jack there. Why does no one bet a jack there? Now, good players bet a jack there, but bad players don't bet a jack there because they're thrilled to get to showdown. They have second pair, they're thrilled to get to showdown. They're not thinking about value, they're just thinking about the fact that I have second pair. If I can show this down, I'll scoop a small pot. I'm completely content with that. Now, a hand like Queen X, I'm not really sure what X would be. Let's just say Queen 9, a small queen, would be pretty happy with that as well. Queen 10 might decide they want a value bet. Queen King might decide they want a value bet, as well as like Ace Queen. Now, if he's only value betting a range that extremely narrow, and also timing might have had something to do with it, as per the video, I'm not positive I remember. I actually think in one of those 5, 10, 6 max videos, I had just gotten my wisdom teeth out like 2 days prior, and I was kind of messed up.
You sounded kind of loopy.
Yeah, it was a little bit loopy, I think. And anyways, but hey, my poker instinct was still there, right? I think that I was, especially if I use the term clown face. Anyways, but so if we've already established that that's his range, that his value betting range is very thin, then it actually becomes sort of a math-based play. It actually becomes sort of if 5% of his range is betting the river on the end for value and 95% of his range is a bluff, then I'm just going to snap call. And so when people say, oh, that was a sick hero call, it was a sick read, blah, 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 that's really what they're talking about. I mean, we went through and broke down the math and the qualitative and quantitative thought process. Even though the quantitative obviously wasn't exact, we actually broke down some of the thought process for a hero call. I mean, that's why when you see a high stakes player, Phil Ivey or somebody call down with a pair of 4s, and you say, wow, that was an amazing call, I'll never be able to do that. I mean, that's not entirely true. In some ways, everybody is able to make these math-based thoughts, and then as a function of flow and the way the game had been playing, you apply the thoughts. If it's the correct moment to apply them, whether it is or whether it isn't.
Well, Aaron, I really appreciate you taking the time. One last thing, and we've had some technical difficulties during this interview, so if you get cut off, unfortunately, that's going to end the show. But what's basically next for you in the sense of, I mean, you've been playing a lot of poker, made a ton of money playing poker. I know you say you're still in school, right?
Yeah, I am still in school, actually.
So what's basically like your plan maybe like over the next 5-10 years if you thought that far ahead?
Yeah, whether it's fortunately or unfortunately, I'm thinking about, I think that far ahead all the time. And, I'm really somewhat unsure. As for poker right now, I'm having already probably my biggest month in October, and it's only halfway done or not even halfway done. And so at the moment, I'm going to continue to kind of run the streets, I like to call it, and just play a ton of No Limit, and play anyone who will play me pretty much heads up. And so at the moment, that's sort of my thoughts. What's in the near future? Continue to play for a little bit longer, as long as the game excites me. And, from there on out, maybe learn PLO when I get a little bit bored. In the future, I'm not sure. For right now, even though I'm in school, still kind of doing the school thing for, say, for I guess just to further my education and for social reasons. I guess it's kind of fun to go to school. I really like going to school still. For the most part, I'm pretty undecided. I guess have the next steps that any 21-year-old would have in some regards, except for maybe I get to buy a house a little bit sooner or something like that.
Well, again, I appreciate you taking the time, and again, everyone can go and look for you over at Lego Poker. That's going to do it for us on Cash Plays. Join us next week. Again, I'm trying to get Barry Greenstein on the show, so that might happen. So until then, have a good week.